All righty. Well, I'd like to welcome all of you here today. So happy to see so many of you. Cover crops are such a great subject for us to all learn about. I'm going to be learning along with you as well. My name is Denise Pinard. I'm a volunteer with the UC Master Gardeners of Santa Cruz and Monterey counties. And before we get started, I know we've all done a billion Zoom meetings, but just as a reminder, we're going to go ahead and ask you to make sure that your microphone is off. I see our note says on. Please don't. So just if you can turn your microphone off, and as much as possible, if you can also turn your video off. It helps us preserve our bandwidth, and that will make for a much smoother class for all of us. We also recommend that you use speaker view. That way you'll get sort of the most bang for your buck as far as the actual visuals that we have for you. For any questions that you have, go ahead and put them in the chat window, and we'll answer them at the end of our class. Let's see, any technical questions that you've got beyond that or anything else, I'm happy to help you with that. Just go ahead and chat with me in the chat, and I'll get that straightened out for you. Let's see. Oh, we have our live transcript on down at the bottom. If you'd like to have sort of a closed captioning kind of experience in addition to the audio, go ahead and click that, and you can watch that along with what you're listening to. And please don't wait till the end if you don't want to. If you have a question, go ahead and put it right in the chat right away, and I'll keep track of it. We'll get that answered at the very end here. I guess you might have noticed the event's being recorded, and you'll receive a link to the recording in a day or two after we get everything all settled and back together. All right, I think that's it. A little bit about the UC Master Gardeners, if you're not really familiar with us. Our program's been around for over 40 years now. We're all volunteers. We work in partnership with the Agriculture and Natural Resources Division of the University of California. We all receive very comprehensive training, and our mission is to provide outreach and research-based education on horticulture, pest management, and other sustainable gardening practices to home gardeners in our local communities. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to our instructors for the day, Delise and Michelle.
Hi there, I'm Delise Weir with a very large broccoli. That was last year. I'm hoping to do that again, thanks to cover cropping. I've been growing for 40 years, at least. That makes me old as dirt, and I do food primarily, but also flowers and herbs. And I'm getting into organic and medicinal herbs this year. I've been a master gardener since 2014. I worked for Renee's Garden Seed Company, and I do love to teach.
All right. And I'm Michelle Wizen. I started organic gardening when I was a teenager, and have done that my whole life. I wouldn't even know what to do with any kind of chemicals that are non-organic. I've been a master gardener since 2010. I'm also trained in permaculture design, and I'm a nurse and educator.
Great. So I'm going to start us out, and this is an overview of what you're to expect out of the class this evening. What is soil? A little bit of soil science. Why is this important to me? And how to add lots of organic matter through cover crops. It's going to be very practical, very detailed, and when you come away, you will know exactly what to do when the time comes. So let's start with, why do we care? What's so important about soil? What's the deal with that? So if we look to the model of agriculture, which is, we are a microcosm of that in our backyard gardens when we grow food, we are in the process with agriculture of destroying a lot of the soil, topsoil that we have on the planet. Agriculture consumes 40% of the arable land on the planet, and we've degraded 60% of it by basically removing the organic matter and supplanting that with chemicals and an awful lot of practices that essentially destroy the health of the soil. Agriculture is generating, and this is in many different forms, so it's kind of a rounded up number, but 25% of greenhouse gas emissions come from some form of agriculture. That can be the tractor's exhaust, that can be the cows blowing methane, that can be food waste, and it's also the soil degradation process. And population, as we know, it's increasing, arable land is reducing, climate is changing, as we read in the news, and the US topsoil is going away at 10 times the rate of natural soil formation. So it takes 100 years to make 1 inch of topsoil in a natural process. And this is an example of that natural process. So here we have macro and micro fauna and flora destroying carbonous material. So this is dead leaves, it's organic matter, and it's being turned into soil or topsoil by the little wee beasties, I like to call them, in this animation on the right. There are 2 classic ways we think about natural soil formation. That's in a forest context, you see the leaves falling, the trees fall over, decomposition happens. There's a lot of mycorrhizae. I don't know if you've been paying attention to the mycorrhizal relationships between trees under the earth, connecting roots to other trees through the fungus, the mycorrhizae fungal network under the soil. But that's a huge and important thing. All that is happening under our feet as we walk around in the forest. So that's one of the 1 inch per 100 years methods. And then there's the prairie soil formation model that we hear a lot about, and that's where you have prairie grasses and different plants that grow up, and then great ungulates, like traditionally it was buffalo, come and stomp on them and kind of rough up the dirt, crush the plants, poop, make improvements to the soil that way. It snows, the plants die, they lie on top of the soil and they stay on top of the soil and they decompose there. And then little by little that layer year after year forms soil. So those are the slow natural methods of making soil. We are going to talk about how to make soil quickly. And we're going to do that in kind of a quick and easy fashion through cover cropping. So let's take a little side trip around to carbon. We talked a little about climate change a minute ago, and carbon is kind of the output of organic matter in the soil, and it's a cycle. So carbon is very infrequently stable, meaning it goes into the soil, it comes out of the soil in a gaseous fashion. It's hard to get carbon sequestered, is the name, where you're putting soil back or carbon back into the soil and out of the air and into the soil and making it less of a problem. And trees do this very effectively. It goes into the body of the tree, goes into the roots, goes into the soil when it decomposes. But there's several kinds of carbon. There's dead carbon, there's really dead carbon, and there's not quite dead carbon. So in order to actually sequester carbon, it has to be kept away from systems like oxygen that allow it to volatilize and turn into a gas, which is part of the decomposition process. So every time you turn your dirt, every time you turn your soil over, you're adding oxygen, and that's like blowing on a fire, and all the little microbes go, oh my gosh, I can breathe. I'm going to eat this carbon, and that creates a gaseous exudate. So that is one of the reasons that some people are interested in no or low till gardening. we are gonna just do a little nod at the end on low-till garden practices for your backyard garden. But what you need to know out of this is that you want to try and keep the carbon in the ground, and you want to do that by adding organic matter. And since it is a volatile thing that kind of comes and goes, you have to keep adding it. You have to do it every year. Yes, your work is never done. That's what I say about that. So another little tidbit about carbon and your horticultural practices in your own backyard. This is a farm up at UCSC. This is the farm and garden up there. And they have three types of farm sites there. They have a tractored, row crop kind of field. It's not monocrop, it's different crops, but it's done organically, but they use machinery. And they have the ability to measure soil carbon, and this is stable soil carbon. So this is carbon that isn't going anywhere. And they have a pretty high rate of soil carbon. That's 2.5 to 3% in that soil. However, they also have hand-tilled beds. They get much less turnover and are done by hand. This is human scale. This is the closest thing that you're going to have in your garden. And after this 54 years of consistent organic farming, good practices, they have managed to accumulate 3 to 4% soil carbon. That's a pretty good thing to achieve. But if you look at their blueberries, the blueberries have been in the ground for, 10 years plus. And that's a perennial crop, so it isn't going anywhere. They're not turning the soil. They're not doing anything with it. They just mulch it year after year and keep it watered and keep it weeded. And that's looking at 7 to 10% soil carbon. So perennials in a food garden are a good thing to have if that's what you're going for. On average, soil carbon is more like 2%. So this is the impact that you can have as a gardener by adding compost, organic material, etc., to your home garden beds. And why do you want to add organic material? Gosh, there's so many reasons. It's incredible. This is not adding carbon per se. This is carboniferous materials. This is organic matter, and it comes in many, many forms. So it conserves water. It basically allows your soil to retain water when it rains and not let it run off or float away. It also improves drainage. So that doesn't really make a lot of sense. It holds the water and it drains the water. Well, it does both. And we'll talk a little bit more about aggregates and why that is. It reduces your need for fertilizer. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Fertilizer, organic fertilizer in particular, requires the bacteria and the fungi to break it down into a usable form that the plants can actually use. So you use less fertilizer and you waste less fertilizer by having good organic matter in your soil. It increases fertility and decreases resource uses. You can get more food out of less land. It's, of course, composting diverts landfills. That's really good. And mostly it makes it softer. So when you're, putting a shovel in the soil and lifting it up to plant, it is so much easier on your body than if your soil is heavy sodden clay or some kind of hard pan. All right, sciencey part continues. What is soil? Well, it's made out of really kind of 4 things. It's mostly rock, mineral particles. And the mineral particles you have are the mineral particles you get. It's basically a place-based geography or geology based thing that tells you what mineral makeup and what those rock particles are going to be like and how big they are. You have very little control over that. And then it's air and water. So that's the spaces in between, because roots don't grow in soil. Roots grow in between particles of soil. And then there's organic matter. Now, this little slice of the pie, it says 5%. you're lucky to have 5% organic matter. That's a good thing. So it can be less and it can be more. And that's made out of organisms. Those are little wee beasties that are chewing up the organic matter you're putting in it. Or it's the little bit larger ones like earthworms. Roots, another kind of organism, are also taking up space. And then there's humus, and that's where you have the decomposing carboniferous material that is maybe going to turn into stable carbon, and maybe it's going to go back into the cycle and go back to the atmosphere. But this little piece of the pie is incredibly important, and a little goes a long way. So here's the rock particles I'm talking about. You might have gravel, you might have some sand, you might have silt, you might have clay, and you can have different proportions of these different sizes of particles. And these are the sort of standard size. Clay particles, you can't even see them, but you sure know when you have a clay soil because it's heavy and it's hard to get water through it. And this is an experiment that you could do at home. You are going to get access to this presentation, so you can click on the links and learn how to do this. But basically you take a little cup of soil, you put it in a mason jar, you shake it up, and you let it sit on the windowsill for about 3 days. And it will settle, and it'll settle out with the biggest particles at the bottom and the finest ones at the top. And usually there's a little kind of cloudy bit at the top in the water, and that's clay that didn't bother to sink down. It was so fine. But this will help you understand the percentage of clay, sand, and silt that you have in your soil. Once you have that, you can go through a process and use this nifty little pyramid of soil to determine what the standard name for your type of soil is. So if I've got 40% sand and let's see, hold on, let's go. 40% sand. I always have a hard time with this. I've just lost my place now. Good Lord.
Around slide 17.
Yes. Hold on. That's not what I wanted to do. I wanted this. And then I wanted this. Thank you all very much for your patience. Okay, so you have the clay axis here on the left, your silt axis here on the right, and at the bottom you have your sand axis. So example is, I'm going to struggle with this. 40% sand. I'm going to follow this line up until I get to 20% clay. And I can't do it without a, I'm sorry, I'm going to fail. Really. I always have trouble with this. I recommend you take it home with you. Look at it in the links that are right here, and they will tell you how to read this chart. But at the end of the day, you will come up with a little colored block that will be your particular soil type. I am a lucky girl with sandy loam in my backyard. And the reason I really found that out is I had my soil.
We don't have sandy loam. What do we have?
What?
Particulate aggregate? You know what we have?
Somebody should probably mute because we can hear you talking. Thanks. So people talk about soil structure. Thank you. And
Okay,
what
how do
soil
I-
structure means,
Thank you.
whoever you are, we can still hear you. Denise, can you try and find that and mute that person? Great. All right, so these particles, the brown ones are particles. So that's your sand, silt, and clay, and they're in the ground. And they are surrounded by cations. And silt and organic matter is the green stuff, and clay particles are these little flat guys. And so they have different electromagnetic attractions. So they act like glue. So the cations, the clay, the organic matter, they chemically act like glue, and they hold particles together. And those particles are sort of like a Rice Krispie treat held together with marshmallow fluff. And so in between those particles, you have space for air and water to go. And that's what makes a nice, loose, rich, friable soil that has lots of room for air and lots of room for water. Here's another example of the same thing, showing the micropores and where the roots will go through between the little soil particles, where the water will hang out. So this is why water can go through, and water can also stay put and hold the water. And there's spaces for fauna and fungi and microbes and bacteria and all your little friends that are taking advantage of the organic matter you're putting in the soil. So it's a very complicated system. And here's a detail about how a clay particle will have positively charged ions that will bump hydrogens on and off of a soil particle that will then basically make a nutrient available to the roots, available to the plant. So this is where you get mineralization of nitrogen and other nutrients, macro and micronutrients, that allow your plant to grow and feed it. Dangerous and irresponsible behavior. So all that is coming from this one little piece of the pie and making it possible for your soil to be improved. And it's so easy to add that. And when I say it's a complicated and complex system, I mean really complex. So we have as many, in this little teaspoon of soil, you have almost as many organisms that are alive as you have people on the planet. Now, I used to be able to say that you had as many people as there are on the planet, but now we're at like almost 8 billion. So that is not quite as many as we have in the teaspoon of soil, but close. And they are decomposers, they are symbiotic organisms that we'll talk about when we get to nitrogen fixation, and saprophytes, which is another type of microorganism. And then you have your macro buddies, you've got your worms that dig and exude and actually make physical difference. And then my favorite digger here is gophers and moles and macroorganisms with vertebrate types. And they actually do a lot of work in the soil. They're very good earth turners if you can keep them off your plants. All right, at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Michelle, and she's going to tell you how to actually make this all happen for you.
All right, thank you, Denise. That was very informative. All right, so we're going to talk about cover crops. What are they? So I'm just going to ask you to do the next slide, or do I have control? I don't think I have control. Thank you. So what are the benefits of cover crops? So Delise talked about adding organic matter, that we really want to try to get that number to be up well above 2%. It's a constant tending to get there because it is so volatile. But this organic matter will also suppress weeds, so it's a lot less work for you to have to do weeding. If you really, I always think about it in terms of, you probably heard the phrase that nature abhors a vacuum. Well, sort of, if you think of the vacuum as open soil, you really don't want to have open soil. You either want to have whatever you're growing in it that you want to grow, or you want to have cover crops going, or you want to have it covered up with compost and straw, but your soil shouldn't just be barren. So, because that's going to help the weeds take over if you do that. They protect the soil surface. So, if you ever watched raindrops hitting bare soil and how it splashes up and it erodes it more, it's part of the process of making soil, but with heavy rains, you can actually lose your topsoil that way. Cover crops loosen hard soil. So if you have a more clay soil, which is a lot more compact because those particles are really small, there are some cover crops that are better than others that'll help you loosen that soil up, and that'll decrease your having to use your back to do that. You're going to use the plants to do it. Reduces the erosion, which I just talked about. Oops, I'm still on that slide. You get more microbes, microbial population, and we already talked about the water retention and infiltration. So we'll go to the next slide. So part of it is, what do you want to do? So doing that soil test is a really good thing, because then you know what you're starting with. But really, whether you end up in the soil triangle where you've got a lot more clay or you've got a lot more sand or whatever, the solution is always add organic matter. So that's really one thing you want to be doing. So, but maybe you know that your soil is low in nitrogen. So there are things you can do. You can get soil tests done and see how much nitrogen. Nitrogen is pretty. It disappears pretty quickly. So it's one of those, when you buy soil or fertilizer and it has NPK, so the N is the nitrogen. So if you're trying to get something to grow fast or grow really green, you're going to put nitrogen in the soil. And so maybe you're noticing that your plants are turning yellow or they're just not very vigorous, then you might need more nitrogen. If you want to scavenge nitrogen, so there are some cover crops that will actually take nitrogen from the atmosphere, which is most of what the atmosphere is. I think it's 78%, and actually bring it into the soil and make it usable. So cover crops can also, some of them flower and they can attract beneficial insects, which is good. Loosen hard or heavy soil. And a lot of things we just talked about. If you want to control erosion, let's say you're on a hillside, so cover crops will help stabilize that. Enhance the mycorrhizae, which Delise mentioned. These are the sort of the strands of fungi that communicate underneath where plants communicate, because plants communicate through chemistry. If you want to add more organic matter, because maybe it's a garden space that's never been used as a garden, so it just really the soil is very poor. So adding organic matter and biomass is really helpful. Maybe you've got animals that you want to forage. If you've got goats or cattle or other kind of critters that like to eat grasses, then that might be a reason why you'd want to do cover crops. And also they prevent soil-borne diseases. All right, next slide. So we talked about testing the soil, and this is one. So Delise, help me with this. This is one you send away for, I'm assuming. I hadn't seen this slide before.
This is one that you send away for. This is a result, a report that I got. There are many soil labs. We're not suggesting this is the only one. There's a number of them, and you can go to the hotline and get a list of the soil labs that are available to you, but you don't really know what your goal is until you know what your gaps are. So that's the benefit of doing a baseline soil test before you plant a cover crop.
Right. All right. So so one of the cover crops you can put in are legumes, and some of the favorites are fava beans, bell beans, peas, vetch, or clover. And these legumes add nitrogen because they're nitrogen, what we call nitrogen fixers. So they work with a mycorrhizae underneath the soil to pull the atmospheric nitrogen out and actually make it usable for the plant. But they also can be food crops. So, some people like fava beans or bell beans, you can grow those. And these look like fava beans in the picture, and you can see the flowers on them. that's right about the time in general where you want to cut them down and add and incorporate them into the soil. But you could let them go and produce a bean and then harvest the bean. You won't get as much nitrogen. You will get some because the plant will hold it, but the peak time to break it down is right in the early flowering or just before flowering. Okay, so we talked about atmospheric nitrogen. That's N2. It's 2 molecules of nitrogen. And this is just a chart kind of talking about how it works. So if you go to the left side where it says nitrogen fixing bacteria live in the legume root nodules. So that would be in those bell beans or fava beans. And these are bacteria that actually, again, will pull it from the atmosphere and make it and fix it. You have nitrogen fixing soil bacteria that it turns into ammonium, which is NH4 with a plus charge on it. And if it gets nitrified, those turn into nitrites and then to nitrates. So there's a whole process that's happening under the ground with all these, and a lot of these bacteria are very specialized in what they do in these chemical breakdowns. So some of these, so the sort of end product is that these things get assimilated into the plants. And then your decomposers are in there, like we call them, I call them, well, I used to teach for Life Lab, we call them the FBI, the fungi, bacteria, and invertebrates. Yep. And those are really important pieces to what's going on in the soil. So you want to have really living soil. You don't want, that's the thing. What happens when you use if you use a lot of chemicals that inorganic, you can actually destroy a lot of these really, really important microorganisms and invertebrates in the soil. So your system will be just broken, essentially. Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. So there are cereals, and cereals tend to have really fibrous roots, and you can see the picture, the insert picture, they're really dense. They can really kind of break up the soil a lot because there's so many roots to them. They can be a food crop. They could be fodder or food for your grazing animals. They do add a lot of biomass. So if you're really just really needing to fluff up the soil, the cereals might be what you want to do. So that would be oats, rye, or winter wheat. I tend to generally use the legumes. I haven't really done cover crop cereals myself, but I don't have, these are big fields of them. So I mostly garden in raised beds, so it's not really needed for a raised bed. Okay, next. And then the brassicas, which are mustards and daikon radish, which is the insert picture. They're like big drills. And if you've got really hard soil, that's a great, and it's a food crop too. So it'll break up the soil and create some more spaces in the soil. So there's room for water and roots to happen for other plants. So you can do black or white mustard or daikon radish. All right, next slide.
I wanted to point out that mustard also has some proven inoculating properties. It can reduce the presence of bad nematodes in soils. So if you're having disease problems or nematode issues, that's a good cover crop that can help you mitigate that problem.
Good.
And there we have all that.
And then there's all the mustards. Yeah. So the mustard, a lot of them are edible, I believe, but they're easy to kill. They provide weed control. They help because you can see how much it's just covering the ground, really, and that's what you want to do. They help clean up problem fields where there's nematode problems. Yeah, I know that there's been a lot of research on that at the university, at the farm, that where they looked at that. They hinder the germination of ryegrasses and other cover crops, so they may be used to clean up a problem cover crop. But and they're really pretty, and these actually will attract some beneficial insects as well. So if you're using buckwheat, this is another really nice looking cover crop when it flowers, and it does attract pollinators. It's very fast growing. It's a cover crop you would use in the summer, or when in the summer to fall, where the weather is warm. It's not really a winter. Like right now, you could be planting your legumes and your winter wheats and stuff like that. You can plant them right now. I probably put mine in maybe a month or so ago, or 6 weeks ago, and they're about 6 inches tall already. But it's not too late to put those in the ground. But in the uh, for the buckwheat, you would, I know, Delise, you've used it in ways where you've had maybe a bare spot in your garden and you just wanted to fill it. Because again, if you think about nature abhors a vacuum, and I think about bare soil being a vacuum, then you want to just fill it in with some buckwheat, and it'll kind of make it look nice, and it'll give you a lot more biomass at the end of that season.
And it's just so darn fast, it doesn't take up space for very long, so you can cut it back. It's really soft and easy to dig back in.
Very
After a week,
Yeah. Yeah.
very helpful.
Yeah. And the other thing is that, plants, plants like that, especially, they're really succulent. They also add a lot of water back into the soil because the plant is holding that water. So, it's good all the way around that way. All right, next one. And I think this is a picture that you took of some buckwheat. So the foreground there is a buckwheat, and then to the right, you can see it looks like tomatoes and
Well, I've got some fallen apples and some flowers, and
fallen
here's a
apples. I can't tell exactly. Yeah,
yeah.
but that's the summer garden with some buckwheat in there. And because I tend to I grow a lot of vegetables, but I intercrop with a lot of flowering things that are going to attract pollinators, because I want the pollinators around. So anything that flowers is good. Facilia, or scorpion weed, you might have seen this. It's used as a cover crop. It is a California native. It attracts pollinators, and you can see why, just because it's so pretty. It's good in orchards between rows. Bees really love it. It's very easy to grow in the fall, and it might reseed because it can perennialize, if that's a word. But it'll reseed, and you'll get it every year once you put it in the ground. And I don't know, I've never grown that, Delise. If you have, is it very easy to cut down or get rid of?
I just learned about it, so I'm trying it this year, and I just planted it. It's jumping up like chia pets in the ground.
Oh,
Really
yeah.
easy to germinate, and I hear that I think you told me it's a nitrogen scavenger.
Yeah.
So it will seek out and find the nitrogen, and then when you dig it in, it can add that nitrogen back, but it doesn't fix nitrogen like a legume.
Yeah.
I just wanted to try it. So I don't know how hard it is to deal with the end, but there's multiple ways to deal with the top of your cover crop. So
yeah, and we'll get into that in a minute. Yeah. So in nature, nature needs diversity, all right, for things, because everything's a system. So if you think about cover crops, pretty much most farmers these days do mixed cover crops. So they'll do a mixture depending on what their goals are. So depending on what their soil, so they know what their soil is like. From that, they kind of figure out what their goals are, and then they can do a blend of cover crops that includes grasses, legumes, and brassicas based on that information. So there is a link here. So when you get the slide deck, I think that's a little tool, right, Delise, to help you.
Yeah, this is a little utility. Unfortunately, it's for farmers and you can only get an acre's worth of seed at a time. So that's a bit much. You might want to go in on a acre's worth, but it's kind of fun because you can pick your goals. You know, I want biomass, I want nitrogen fixing, and I want pollinators. And it'll ask you what time of the year you're planting and how long it's going to be in the ground and stuff like that. And that will give you some options to mix and match. If you don't want to get that fancy, you go and buy something called, what's it called? Soil Builder Mix. And a lot of the local farm supply places have that.
Yeah.
And if I was starting new, I noticed there's a question about somebody starting out. If I were starting a brand new field or beds, I would do a mix.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
Great.
Okay, so planting. So you're going to clear and rough up the soil surface. You're going to broadcast the seed. So when I do like I did bell beans this year, and I just did straight bell beans. I just poke a little hole with my finger and stick it in the hole. So I don't use a hula hoe or anything like that. I basically clear out the bed from whatever was growing in the summer in there, and but I don't worry about it getting it too perfect. I just get the big stuff out and I put it in my compost so that can start happening, and then I poke them in. But if you're doing from smaller seeds, you're going to broadcast the seed according to the coverage directions. And that's a picture of a hula hoe if you don't know what that is. And it's a great tool for weeding or for just to get things kind of covered up. It's very light and easy to use. You might want to put a little compost on the top of it. I like to do that. I think it's good to, it doesn't generally hurt to add compost a couple of times a year, at least, especially if you're growing a lot. Let's see, you want to, we got a typo on number 3 still, but you want to hoe it in or back rake it to make sure you basically want the seed to be in the soil. So it's not just sitting on top, because the other thing you're going to run into is the birds are going to discover it and they'll eat all your cover crop. So, and I generally tend to put a little bit of straw mulch over the top to kind of deter the birds as well. You want to water it in, and usually this time of year, we were lucky this year because we got rain in October. I just look at the weather and I go, okay, it's going to rain tomorrow, cover crops going in today. Right? So I don't have to do the hand watering or anything. Like my drip system's off already. So you can also cover it with a black tarp or wet newspaper for a week or two or some people use Agribond, just basically something that's going to keep the birds out, keep it warm so it'll actually germinate quicker. Okay, and there's a video. You'll get to see that later. Or are we going to show that today? No, we're going to see it later.
I think.
Okay. Occultation, I'm not quite sure how you say it. It basically comes from the word occlude. So if you think about occlude, okay, that means I'm going to cover something up. So you can use what's called the black silage tarp. And this is it's a plastic tarp, so it doesn't decompose, but it can be used over many years. So it's not, use it once, throw it away kind of thing. But it does exclude light, so you have weed control without herbicides. It maintains that moist habitat for your decomposers, and you can use it over time. And the downside, it doesn't decompose. So cardboard's the other option. It will it cools the soil because it's not black. The black is really you've heard of the albedo effect, it's basically how much reflection of the sunlight you get on a surface based on its color. And so black absorbs a whole lot more, and white reflects it. So, but it will suppress weeds, and it's, people use cardboard for, like, if you wanted to take out a lawn, you don't want to like hack the lawn out, because if you think of all that grass, that's just biomass. So you just cover it up with cardboard and it'll kill it, and you can plant right on top of that, and you've got, an insta cover cropping going on underneath there. So, but it does provide the habitat for the decomposers, and you got to keep it wet, so you got to really soak it in, and generally use it once, but it'll decompose over time. So right now, again, is the time to plant your cover crop. I don't know when our next rain is coming, but probably the soil is quite workable now. Generally, if it's really, really wet, you don't want to be planting in really, really wet soil, because it actually compresses, and you get a lot of the airspace loss when you're trying to work really wet soil. So you want to definitely be not right after a rain, but you really want to try to time it right before a rain, when things have dried out a little bit, hopefully. And you just leave it in the ground, and you get to take your winter break, and spend your time, looking at seed catalogs and designing your garden for the next year and doing those kind of fun things, and take a break from being in the garden so much. And then you start checking it in late February, because you're starting to think, okay, we got the spring planting is going to start happening in March, right? So you want to start thinking about what you're going to do, and you're not going to be able to plant for a couple of weeks at least, probably, because you got to get it to decompose a bit before you actually plant. All right.
So can I speak to the images here?
Oh yeah, because I don't know what they are.
What the heck is that? So these, on the left here, you've got a legume mix that I planted right before the first big rain.
Okay.
And this is what it looks like now. So it popped up. It's very thickly sown. I think I overdid that. But I just sprinkled a little straw on it to protect it from the birds. And so that's what it is after a couple of days, about a week. This is one of those blends. It's got legumes and grass, and it is probably ready to take down. If I waited any longer, it would be tough and woody and way too hard to dig up.
And when did you plant that one?
So this is from last year.
Okay.
And I cannot tell you where it's at, but I'm guessing that I planted in November, as I almost always do. And this is probably in late February or March.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, that cycle of when you bring it down to get the best benefit and the kind of best ease of breaking it down, is you want to make sure it's not going to the woody stage, and when it's just early flowering. So depends on, so if you're growing for nitrogen, you want to do it right before the bloom. And if you're growing for pollinators, you want to let it bloom. And if you're growing for the biomass, you cut before the stems become fibrous. So you can wait a little longer. And if you're growing for other reasons, you just harvest it accordingly. So, generally, somebody was telling me recently that they put in fava beans, and then they have, I don't know, I think they said they had their goats mowed it for them. And I was trying to think about, well, what's the advantage? I mean, because then you're not getting the biomass of the plant into the ground, but you're also getting the goat in there, who's probably doing some fertilizing for you too. So I'm not quite sure what the exact advantage are. And they wouldn't take everything, but they would take the roots would still be in there.
Yeah, and it's really important, even if you're removing the top of the biomass, to leave the roots in the ground, because the roots exude stuff that are going to help with your aggregation. And some people grow for fodder, so feed the goats. There you go.
Yeah. So to hasten, okay, we got that one. All right, so the end of the growing season, so you're going to cut everything down. And So people use different techniques. You can use a shovel, especially if it's still pretty soft, a weed whip, a scythe, lawnmowers,
Damn
head
it.
weeders, all kinds of things to just chop it up. You want to, and mostly because I have raised beds. I just do it all by hand. It's just I just do one bed at a time. I don't do them all at once. So, but if you've got a pretty extensive area, you might want to use a machine like the weed whip or something.
And the weed whip, if you've got a tall stand of fava beans or something, you can kind of raise it up and bring it down and chop it up as you're
Right.
chopping it down.
Yeah. So the smaller, I mean, you want to, generally sort of rule of thumb for when you're trying to compost things is that you want it 6 inches or less. So you want it to be fairly, so or less is a good number to look at, because you really want it. The smaller it is, the faster it's going to decompose, and the sooner that you're going to be able to plant. So it depends on how quickly you want to plant. If you got a lot of time, you can leave bigger pieces there. But if you want to plant, pretty soon, you want to chop it up a little bit more. Okay, so these are some options. So option 1 is to dig it in, leave it on the surface to decompose, because you want that oxygen to oxidize things, and then you dig it into the soil, and then you got to wait 3 or 4 weeks to plant. So you want to plan all this. Like if you like to plant a spring garden, you really want to think about, okay, what would be my first planting date, and then work backwards from there. Option 2 is to compost it. So just basically you put the tops in the compost pile and you water it and wait, and you wait just about a week. So you don't have all that biomass in your bed, that's a picture of a bed. And you can plant a little sooner, but you're still using the biomass in your compost, and will go eventually into your bed later on as your plants get a little older and need some uplifting. And then option 3 is chop and drop, where you just basically leave it on the surface, water it in well, and then you can cover it with that silage tarp or black plastic or cardboard and let it decompose for a couple of 2-3 weeks. And then you plant right into it. You're not going to be digging it down under that. Delise was talking earlier. When I first, many years ago, when I first started learning about organic gardening, and they were talking about the French intensive method or double digging. And there are times when double digging is important, but you don't want to double dig your beds all the time, because so today that the sort of thinking about it is the no-till gardening will sequester that carbon more for you.
If you're just starting out, double digging is an awesome thing to get going with.
There are times when it's
not an annual event.
Yes, it's not. It shouldn't be an annual event. And when long time ago, when I first learned about it, I was doing it every year, and then I learned about no-till. So it's good.
Honor you.
It's a lot less work too to do the no-till. So there's these sort of sequential pictures. It just turns into soil. It all breaks down. And see how dark and rich that soil looks? That's what you want your soil to look like. Just really kind of fluffy and dark, and yeah, that's the yummy stuff for plants. So this is this another sequential picture? This is
an example of chopping and dropping,
Okay.
which it kind of is not intuitive to some of us. So this shows there's buckwheat growing, and then there's some buckwheat that got chopped and is under the silage tarp.
Oh, I
And if
see.
you pull back the tarp, oh look, it's there, and it's kind of dead, then dry and looking like straw.
Yeah.
And then here it is, and I planted a little plant in it. We've got a mulch already in place. These in the bottom are little weeds that have been blanched because there's been no sunlight. So we're pre-germinating weed seeds and then nipping them in the bud by having them under that tarp for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
So chop and drop.
Yeah, it makes life a little easier. The other thing you can do is put your chickens to work. They love, so I have chickens and they'll just scratch an area to just for fun. They're always looking for something. So they'll do a lot of work for you. And so put them to work because they love doing that kind of stuff.
Them to work.
Put them to work, yeah. And that's it. So this is a buckwheat and brassica and buckwheat and grass, it looks like. And a bird, some kind of bird, a bluebird.
Yeah. And has a question. This is Denise, you're going to tell us what people are asking about.
I am. All right. So one from way back in the beginning, talking a little bit, I think something you mentioned just quickly, what does reduced weed pressure mean?
Yeah, the pressure. So it's referring to if you've got a lot of weeds. I'm not quite sure in the context it was talking about, but what cover crops will do is they'll outcompete the weeds, and so you won't get as many weeds. So you have less weed pressure. I don't know if that answers the question. I don't know the context it was asked in. Do you have any?
I missed it too, so I don't know exactly where it came from either.
It was in one of the slides. It was in the text. We didn't really speak to it, but basically cover crops help you choke out the weeds and prevent you from getting, as many weeds.
Right.
They're always there, aren't they?
Yes.
Let's see. So we kind of covered just really quickly, make sure that this was about developing and building a brand new site on heavily clay soil. And I think, Delise, you suggested that just the best cover crop would really be a mixture of all kinds of things to kind of get it started. I think that was sort of covered.
And also, if it's the first time you're going to be working that and preparing it into a bed, you do want to do a double dig on it, and you can look that up. How to do a double dig, because there's a little technique to it. But because you really want to, it's probably not very. It's poor soil probably if it hasn't been worked before. So the first.
I noticed that this question is from a person who has 9 acres of heavy clay soil.
Oh, wow.
So that would not be a double dig situation for the entire 9 acres, of course.
No, it would not.
It's if you have a tractor, then the grasses are really good for breaking up clay soil, those fibrous roots. You're going to need something to help you turn that under to improve the soil. A soil test would also be a really good way to start. And for those of you who have orchards, I see you're planting a few fruit trees. Mustard is a very common inter-row cover crop, and the Kodiak mustard has multiple benefits. It helps with pollinators, and it also does that allelopathic thing and prevents weeds and improves the soil and the nematode thing.
Right, prevents disease.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Let's see. I think that it was quickly mentioned the idea of putting cover crops between the rows of trees, and if that, let's see, is it a good idea to do that? Are there advantages to putting that versus? I think that this person has just kind of right now sounds like just kind of bark sort of that had been spread between the trees.
Yeah, well, it's going to increase your soil fertility, and it'll also, depending on what you're planting, it's going to attract pollinators, which you want, especially in the spring when your trees are starting to flower. So you really need to think about what kind of you don't want to. Because you could set up a competition too. So if you don't want to have too many flowering things, you want the pollinators to go to the trees and not to your cover crop. But So you have to sort of look at the timing of it, I think. But yeah, it's a good idea. I mean, anytime you can improve the soil by adding biomass and nitrogen and carbon, you should do it. I mean, trees
Now,
do.
I'm
Trees.
noticing in the question, there's something about a weed barrier under the bark. And the question is, do I have to take up the weed barrier? You absolutely should take up the weed barrier if you're going to plant a cover crop. And it's also not a bad thing to mulch under the tree line of the tree with wood chips, and then do a strip of cover crop in between the rows.
Yeah, yeah, and when you mulch with the wood chips, just make sure you don't put it up against the tree trunk itself. You want to make a well around the base of the tree because you don't want fungi to be trapped against the bark and cause some disease issues. But and you can put 6, 8, 10, 12 inches around your, of thick of mulch. If you you don't need a weed barrier if you're doing that. That's your weed
True.
barrier.
All right, and kind of a related comments question here was about that cover crops don't seem to grow well on top of several inches of the wood chips. So it seems that you have to choose either the mulch or the cover crop. Is that?
Yeah, because wood chips aren't soil. They're really just a piece of carbon for the most part. Because soil is, as Elise talked about earlier, it's very complex. And so the seeds need to be in contact with soil. So you need to get them into the soil to get them to germinate.
Now, I'm going to just say that if you are a magical being like Orrin Martin at UCSC is, where I don't know how he does it, but every year he mulches under the tree line, he cover crops under the wood chips, and the cover crop comes up, and it's usually a big seeded bean that he cover crops with, and then they cut that down and take it away and compost it. Somehow he makes that happen. So go figure. I think it has to do with how decomposed the lower layers are.
Right, and he probably doesn't put in super thick redwood or bark chips on top of it because the legumes they'll push through a lot of stuff. So
you could try it, but it's not the norm.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Comments maybe about using cardboard because it does seem to attract a lot of less than savory critters, cockroaches, water bugs, certainly slugs. Thoughts on that?
I'd say all mulch is kind of a trade-off that way.
Yeah.
It can be a habitat for slugs and critters, earwigs.
Because the idea is that it's keeping it moist, and they like that too. Just so happens. Yeah. I mean that's a whole nother kind of topic, but it is a trade-off, I think.
I use cardboard on the ground to suppress the weeds and keep it dark. And then I put wood chips or some kind of heavy mulch over that. And I use that in the pathways. And I usually just mulch directly on the soil around the crops. So I don't ever use cardboard in my food beds, but I use it on the edges.
Yeah. Yeah, me too.
Okay. All right. Let's see. A new home with clay soil. Do you have some ideas about organic soil conditioners that have humate soil and gypsum?
Well, I'd start with getting a soil test possibly and figuring out what you got there so before you start adding a whole lot of supplemental things that you may or may not need, and really kind of try to dial in what the soil is needing. And then again, as I said earlier, adding organic matter is always the solution.
Yeah,
right.
I would say you can actually pre-inoculate a brand new bed with a whole lot of purchased compost and plant a cover crop.
Yes.
Do it all.
Yeah.
Okay. Is straw sufficient to keep the birds off?
It works for me with the bell beans and the fava beans. I haven't done the other types of cover crops, but yeah, it works for me. I had those are open beds, and they came up roaring this year. I mean, looked like every seed germinated. So
It's weird. I've had years where the birds get every single seed in my cover crop planting, and I've had years where everything just pops up. And I like to think that the little sprinkling of straw bamboozles them, confuses them somehow. It seemed to be working for me this year, but I think there's good years and bad years.
some people use they'll get that shiny tape stuff and put it. I just put it on little bamboo poles and stick it around the bed. But what happens? A lot of people kind of misuse those because you shouldn't keep them in your garden all year. You really only need to use them when the seeds are starting to sprout at the time that the birds might get them. And once they're established, then you want to take those out because the birds will adapt to them. So you want to be sort of random with them in that way. But some people use that when they put the seeds in, they'll put shiny tape around just to keep the birds away, and that can be helpful.
And the other bird protection, I trot out my good old silage tarp right after I plant, and I leave it on for a week. And that warms the soil and makes everything germinate and be happy, protects it for a few minutes, and sort of prevents the birds from getting everything. Or I'll use floating row, agra fabric, or frost blanket are another names for that. And that's a great way to keep the birds off.
Yeah, I've done that too. But yeah, when I'm starting a vegetable, because I start most of my vegetables from seed, and if I'm doing that, I usually put an agribond cover over the top till they get going.
There you go.
All right. Do you have a list or so of the best weed suppressant cover crops?
Oh, I'm going to show you a website or a tool that is not on the reading list. Gosh, this might be it. Well, I think I have it somewhere in here.
And what was it?
We skipped over it. It's Organic Valley. It's Peaceful Valley Farm Supplies cover crop grid.
Oh,
And it's just amazing. Here it is. Here it is. It is just an amazing resource. If it ever loads. There we go. So if you look over here, you see the different cover crops. If you look across the top, it'll tell you whether they're selling you conventional or organic seed and all the things that it does. Does it provide quick growth? Does it attract beneficials?
oh, cool.
Does it control erosion? And you can scroll down and it's got every cover crop in the friggin' world.
Yeah, it
And
does.
you've got cool weather annuals, warm weather annuals, perennial, pasture, and erosion mixes. So this is kind of my go-to thing if I'm looking for a couple of different, qualities. Shade tolerant, for example. Crimson clover is shade tolerant. Who knew? And it also fixes nitrogen, and it's also cold hardy. So this is a great tool.
That's good.
Recommend it. And it's in our in our little reading list at the back.
All right, and you inadvertently and cleverly just answered the next question, I think, in a sense. It was about if there were any California native cover crops, and I happened to see a column for that exact question on that chart that you just showed. So unless you know some off the top of your head.
The only ones that they have on that list is bird's foot trefoil, which I've never seen or grown. And then the Facilia that we talked about earlier, that's a native. And they will attract native pollinators, so good on you.
Yeah.
All right. Is it logical, or do you soil test all of your individual beds, raised beds, or do you assume that they're all fairly similar if the soil came from the same original source and you're rotating crops every year?
Well, I have an opinion, Michelle. How about you?
Well, all my soil's pretty similar because I generally treat them the same and I rotate my crops. So I don't get soil testing done every year. I've probably just done it once in the last 8 years or something, because I just keep adding organic matter to it all the time. So, yeah. What do you want?
If you have raised beds and you're putting the same source soil in all of the beds, then what I would do is I'd take a little spoonful, a little trowel of each, and mix them up.
Mm.
And that'll give you kind of a good idea. What I like to do is I like to find a corner of the garden that I haven't done anything with, test that, my native soil, see what I'm starting with, and then test it a year or two later and see how incredibly well I've improved it.
Oh, nice. You get 2 data points that way.
Yeah.
All right. Do you have just a general idea of what the cost for soil testing is?
Yeah, it should be $25 to $60 depending on where you go and what test you're looking for.
Okay. All
And
right.
the one I showed you, I think it was $35, and it came with all kinds of information and included some recommendations.
All right. So I think for now, at least there's only one other question. It's a little bit off the topic, but it might kind of relate if we're looking at cover crops. It's actually addressing mulch and the potential for mulch and fire being an issue.
So yeah, I know a lot about fire stuff. So if you talk to if you're trying to harden off your property, which for fire, you want to not have anything that's flammable within 5 feet of your property, of whatever you're trying to protect, and then 30 feet of well-trimmed things that aren't going to ladder up fuels, where you've got underbrush and then that burns to a higher tree and so forth. But if you've got soil, if you've got bark, so a lot of people use bark as a kind of decorative thing next to their house. The fire people don't recommend that. They want to see it down to the bare soil, or you're using a gravel or hardscape kind of thing next to your house. Because what we saw, and I actually have a friend who lost their house in Bonnie Doon from the fires 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, and they, or whenever that was, it seems like forever ago, but they were creeping fires, and her house burned down because it was just creeping in the mulch, and it got onto the some wood that was part of the foundation that was touching the ground, and it just went up the wall. So anything that's organic, it's going to burn. And so they recommend you. So when we're in fire season, all around my house it's raked down to dirt. And then in the winter I don't worry about it because the fall happens and the leaves happen and you know there's stuff everywhere. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, mulch will burn for sure.
All right, those are all the questions we have for now, unless someone wants to throw something in quickly.
Thank you all for being here. Let's, we have a couple more slides here. One thing is that we like to continually improve. So we're going to be sending you a little survey. It's like maybe 5 minutes. And you can tell us how this went for you and what we could do to improve and what you would like us to offer in the future. And in fact, Michelle and I were talking and we thought, let's just ask everybody, what are they looking for? We're in the process of planning next year's classes. So if you could all just throw into the chat classes you would like to see us offer, we will take those to heart. You will also receive within a couple of months, it takes a little while, an email survey from the California, excuse me, Master Gardener program in Sacramento. So this is the California State Master Gardener program. And they want to know if you applied the information that you learned here today. And that is a way that they can demonstrate impact. That's how we get our funding. We're an all volunteer organization. We encourage you to answer that survey, and hopefully you're going to have grown some cover crops and can answer yes to that question. And then if you are stumped, don't have an answer to a question of pretty much any kind about your garden, you can always try the UC Master Gardener hotline, and here is a link to the hotline. It is not really a phone hotline, it is more of an email hotline, but you can attach photos and long-winded stories about what's going on in your garden.
And what will happen is that one of our volunteer master gardeners will do the research and look at what the evidence-based research is to help you with your problem and get back to you about it.
So it looks like we're going to be taking a little break in December, and we wish you all happy holidays. And if we do offer a quick pop-up class, just you all be notified, because now that you have attended a class and registered for it, you are on our mailing list. So if we do pull something together at the last minute, we'll put it out there and you can join us. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you in 2022.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Denise.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.